the idea is just have a massive bandwidth to handle chaos. So I think if you can get into those deep end ranges and not just produce force, but various forces,
Yeah.
whether it's leveraging momentum, velocity, pure concentric, like contractile tissue contracting, I think on paper, it sounds like it'll probably help you create a larger bandwidth.
That was Anthony Cockrill, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. This week's guest is Anthony Cockrill. Anthony is the director of volleyball sports performance, as well as being the assistant director of Olympic sports performance at Southern Methodist University. Anthony has a strong focus on explosive strength development, getting notable vertical jump improvement in his volleyball athlete population. There are different layers to the strength equation, and not all types and modes of lifting will offer equal adaptation. On today's podcast, Anthony discusses the nuts and bolts of his training program and gets into those modes of lifting, talking about the phases and specifically the eccentric or lengthening phase of the lift, how he emphasizes that. He also gets into plyometrics, in-season training, gymnastics, this and much more on the show. It was great having Anthony on the podcast. Let's get to 458 here with Anthony Cockrill. Anthony, it's great to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is one I've was hoping to be on someday, and here we are.
Yeah. I love the outdoor venue, by the way. I try to take as many meetings as I can sitting out on my back porch. So the sunshine, I think the sunshine makes for some good vibes. And I really enjoy watching what you've put together in training. You know, like we talked a little bit about before I pushed record here. These are methods that have been around, but I think the way that you've put everything together is really unique, and it just looks like a very powerful training system. So I'm excited to get into that today. And you know, with anything, the longer I've been doing this, the more I'm interested in, well, what sport did you do? Like, what got you into this? Because sometimes that tells the story of how the training ends up coming together as well. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what your journey as an athlete and what got you into sports performance.
Well, my journey was very short because I'm not a good athlete. So I didn't play anything in college. Loved sports growing up, basketball. Unfortunately, I'm very small, so that got cut off really quick. But I love basketball. I've always been around it my whole life. And then when I got into this profession, my senior year of my undergrad, didn't really know it was a thing. Kind of got thrown into football, like most anybody that starts out in this profession in the collegiate setting. And I just kind of ran with it with no macro goals and just kind of see where it takes me. But yeah, basketball was it growing up. And then kind of as I've been in this field in the collegiate setting, worked with every sport under the sun, probably at some point, extensively with basketball up until this year, where now it's volleyball. And then volleyball, I've been training in probably like 5 total years in some capacity. But yeah, man, I think all those experiences of different sports, they're all applicable to some way to what you're doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a collection. And it's interesting too, I think, to start with. On one hand, it's interesting to start by having done a lot of sports all the way through, but then it's also interesting to having a blank slate too. I know that's what it was like with me in swimming. I was a terrible swimmer in my early years. I would say I'm average in terms of if you just took a bunch of people off the street and had them swim, I would be above average. But compared to anyone who actually swims, I'm very, very poor. But you know, that blank slate gave me it was nice to start with no expectations. And
that's how I feel with volleyball, because like I said, I've never played the sport. Even being 5 years, I can't even serve the ball over the net if I tried. And like going into it, like when I first started training a volleyball team, I still had a basketball. So usually in the college setting, basketball is kind of the priority. And sometimes these other sports get thrown into the back burner. So like I had no like real high expectations on how to train this team. I just kind of trained them like I would honestly train a basketball team, just in that my time in that place. It just made sense. And then I come to learn that that sport really values training. I think in the same capacity as like maybe a baseball, hockey, maybe even like, I don't think to the caliber of track and field quite yet. But they really understand the importance of physicality and training. And so as soon as I realized that, I was like, oh, sky's the limit with training. I can do so much because when the kids know it's important, and obviously you can train with a little more intent, you can do a lot of fun things. And then once I realized that, in comparison on the opposite end of the spectrum of basketball, where sometimes it's pulling teeth to get kids to train. And so sometimes it cannot be so fun. I was like, okay, like there's a lot of potential here with volleyball and training. And I still feel like it's very like untapped, at least in the collegiate setting, as far as not a lot of people pushing that narrative or trying to make it a priority. But you can, and I think you can make a lot of quantifiable impact in that sport, which I think is unique in the college setting.
Yeah. Yeah. As I've seen it in my college experience, females will train very hard, if not harder than the men in many situations. Sure. And so it's definitely a lot of fun to work with a group that wants to work.
Yeah.
So with your setup, I'm curious as well, in addition to your sports training background, who some of the big, just because I think, when we just start, if it's just standard practice, NSCA and lifting history, we start from square one and then we kind of build out. And where did you pick up some of the main themes in terms of like isometrics and the eccentric phases and all that stuff? Who were some main mentors that influenced the way you view strength and power development for your groups?
There's a lot of people, a lot of indirect mentors too, that some probably have no idea. I think in this age of social media. But the first one specifically, like going into the idea of like the weight releasers and the heavy eccentrics, like tempo things. My time at Houston, with that men and women's basketball program. So Bree Brown, who's at the University of Miami with women's basketball, and Alan Bishop, who's coaching in this national championship today. Those two heavily, like from like an eccentric standpoint, my first ever exposure with weight releasers. And then after that, Tim Karen, more recently, he's just like kind of like gone really deep into the rabbit hole of like the periodizing and the systems and applying like these contraction type kind of deals. Christian Thibodeau obviously has a ton of information and is very like thought out in the world of like the isometrics. Ben Prentice, maybe more like an indirect, obviously in the hockey space in the private sector. He's a great mind. For some reason, I don't think a lot of people know about him, but they definitely should. He obviously runs like an omni contraction type system. We're emphasizing these certain contraction types. Those are probably like really big hitters. And then as far as like just developing, like that comes with experience in my own, like just seeing how like taking successful things in all these places and trying to apply those successful things in my own place has kind of got me to the point where I'm at today. But yeah, all those people kind of planted the seed and I'm just keep watering it now to get to the point where I'm at.
Yeah. I think a lot of back thinking about my first comment with like, or my comment with like, we start with like basic 3 sets of 10 NSCA or 5 sets of 5, and we kind of go from there. I think a lot of people's first stop after this tends to be like triphasic training, which again, very similar things. It's just how does it get laid out? And I know I've had conversations with Christian Thibodeau about, he'll do like an eccentric day and an isometric day in the same week, where versus a more like laying it out in blocks. And we could say, all right, well, what's better, right? I mean, there's a lot of context to that for sure too. But I think ultimately we learn by exploring, okay, here's my system and here's this population and here's what we do. And here's when they're, like you talk about, when are they jumping the highest? How do we undulate that throughout the year? And I appreciate that. I think the answers lie if we're talking about what types of lifts and when to look at the whole year. Because if you don't look at the whole year or year over year, it's a lot harder to find the best answer, because it's almost like you start in a bottle and you can only see inside that little bottle, and you have to get outside of it to the year and the year over year to start to answer that question a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Like the year over year, and like it's like not just a singular year, like what's 3 to 5 years, and looking back, that's something we really try to like hammer home from like just like not even like just like a periodizing for like a peaking kind of idea, but just managing maybe stressors. if we can like based off of 3 years of data at this time of the year, we're seeing these same exact trends that better prepares us going forward into the next few years and just keep like refining that until we in our heads optimize it maybe in quotation marks. But the same thing in training. I think like for us, like in volleyball, I try to keep it really simple from a goal standpoint. Just jump higher than everybody and then stay healthy and you'll probably be okay. So if we can kind of like hone in on just those two qualities and we don't get spread ourselves and all these other things we try to do, then we can kind of narrow down, okay, what times of the year is it most important for us to be maybe jumping our highest? And for us, like as a team macro goal, it's going to be in the NCAA tournament when it matters the most, maybe. So then like that narrows us into that 1 year. And then, but again, looking back to the previous 3 years, how can we get to that point? Almost guaranteed, most effectively. And it's just refining systems we've done in the past and maybe managing a little different at different times of the years. But I do think a lot of people miss the boat there with like looking again, like in 3 year standpoints instead of just like 6 weeks and 8 weeks and 12 weeks in a year. Because like there's trends, there's big trends in the macro standpoint that can be really useful if you look for it.
Yeah, yeah. I kind of structured the show to get into more of those in the latter half. So I feel like I'm destroying the flow of this by going into, but maybe this will be good because I think maybe we'll just start with the most basic unit, which is just the lift itself, and then work itself out to, okay, well, how are you actually going to be coaching that with a tempo or overload? And then how does it look like for the whole year? So let's take a look at, we'll just first, okay, like I know you do a lot of Zercher type work, and I've gotten massively switched on to that as a squat variation, a lot through it's like Bill Hartman's type work and just thinking about where's the center of mass and as well as working your legs more effectively and those types of ideas. But tell me a little bit about like progression. So progression freshmen or upperclassmen, how do you view the teaching of the squat itself as it pertains to a maximal loading for vertical jump improvement and just being a better athlete?
Yeah, I think for us, like regardless of the situation, we're kind of looking at like a 1 year window for kids in the nature of just NCAA athletics now. So you kind of have to like maximize the time within the 1 year. So it kind of just, you have to throw out like the long-term kind of deal now, because you never know if a kid's going to stay or not. So how can I maximize results within 1 year? So like these nice thought out progressions for like freshmen in year one and year two kind of go out the window completely. So that kind of like dictates some of the ideas of progression for us. So I really value just like the back squat only for the amount of variations we can build off of it. And from like just a standpoint of the time constraint we have, and I have to maximize the most within the limited amount of time. I like the back squat because I can do 1,000 different variations with the bar on the back. So that's kind of like the end goal from a squatting standpoint. And then from there, just the idea of like training the legs, kind of like we're in this point of like super maximal loading on the spine, on the torso. The torso is always the limiting factor when trying to load the legs in like a squat where there's no support or the limited support. Obviously a little different if you're doing like a Hatfield style thing or a hack squat where there's a lot more support. But we're not doing that. So for us, the torso is always the limiting factor. So we try to address it as early as possible because in like these later phases of our off season, like we're in right now, where we're really trying to load the legs, we want the legs to be fatiguing and not anything else. So early on, a lot of front loaded variations, front and Zercher squats. I've kind of moved away from a ton of front squatting. I do it, but only maybe for a 3-week period. I used to do it like exclusively instead of Zerchers. But I just think the technical piece it's just a little more technical than the Zercher as far as like getting kids into that front rack position. And then now that's the limiting factor. And it's like we're kind of like losing time teaching things that are so minute. It's like, okay, well, how can I get load on the torso as soon as possible? Zercher's pretty simple. It's not very technical unless there's like some inhibition as far as like just bending like the knee or the ankle or the spine or whatever. So for us, we use the Zercher in the front squat exclusively in like the first half of the off season to put a ton of load on the torso. That's really it. And it's a great, I value the Zercher a ton more now. And I like this year, especially I've only like Zerchered way like 6 weeks in comparison to 3 weeks in prior years. just because it's such an easy teaching tool. There's not a lot of thought to go into it. And it's really easy to load really aggressively early. And honestly, from an assessment standpoint, it allows you to expose some like minutia, like things for individuals. Obviously, most of the time it's going to be the torso, and you'll see like the upper back just go and the hips get behind. Obviously, in my population of kids, the quads are pretty underdeveloped. So you'll start seeing like this good morning kind of style thing out of the bottom if you load too much too early. So it's a great assessment from that standpoint. But again, just going back to, it allows us to load the torso early. So the torso is not a limiting factor once we do get into like what we're in now with like these super maximal loads with the bar on the back.
Yeah, with the Zercher too, and I mean, hopefully everyone listening is familiar with it. You're basically holding a bar in front of you in the crook of your elbows.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the things I notice about that, I feel like it's almost, in a way, it's a different lift with a fat bar, because I see that you use fat bars.
Yeah.
And the narrow bar, I mean, there's once you get the learning curve, I mean, I feel like if you go up real slow over a long period of time, you start to get that groove and you can handle it. But I would think too, with female athletes, that might take even longer. And, just like the muscle mass you have in the forearms and everything there to pad against that bar.
Yeah,
so I saw you have
tough.
fat bars there. Or do you use fat grips too? Or is there?
So we'll exclusively use the fat bars. Obviously, like the more surface area, the more you're touching, it kind of dissipates that pain in the elbow from the thin bar. But if you don't have thick bars, we'll just use fat grips. Same idea, just making the surface area bigger so it's more comfortable. But yeah, that's the only way I've ever done that. I will never go back to using a narrow bar.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is interesting. I think that's why I didn't use it just early, because it was like I was exposed to the narrow bar version. And if any discomfort will downregulate your nervous system to the output of it. But if you feel good, it's a totally different story. And for me, after like a month of it, I can get to the point where I feel fine and it's about the same. But, for it, I would say that a lot of athletes, it's going to be a lot worse than that for sure. So it's definitely, and I know you do it with the heel elevation as well, which seems like that's the sauce right there. It's almost like you have, again, two different lifts. Narrow bar Zercher with feet flat on the ground versus fat bar and slant is so different.
Yeah. So again, going back to just the idea within my like volleyball population, and we're trying to maximize like going from general to specific, and the approach jump from what I'm training is the most specific thing that we're looking to drive results into. So I just think the quads are obviously a big player, along with like some technical aspect. But if there's just general qualities that we can address within the weight room, I think the quads are a big player, especially as we get into like the penultimate stuff and like the block legs. But that's again later. So and for most females and just most people, like just coming this idea of just general large ranges of motion, having the bandwidth to handle things in large ranges of motion, including knee flexion. Most people don't have that. So a very comfortable way to promote knee flexion and loading like the quad into end range knee flexion is just elevating the heels. We try to get on a 20-degree slant board. No, I feel like any more is too much. And I don't have I don't have a goal for them to ever go flat. That's not the point. Because I don't really care if they're like super great squatters with flat feet. That's not what they're here for. I'm trying to drive like a stimulus into loaded knee flexion. And that allows me to get into those positions in the easiest way. And then you compound that with the Zercher, like you're saying, with the center of mass shifting out. It just allows their torso to be so upright. And for when then we go into these maximally loaded squatting, we're starting to like groove this pattern of an upright torso and using the quads to drive out of the bottom of the squat. So it's a great starting point for how we want to train the back squat and do the weight releasers and do the overcoming isometrics. And we're trying to specifically train the quads with the squat, because that's really the end game for us. And then just this idea of handling stress through this bandwidth, hence why we do the squat and not a leg extension. And from like a skill component and kinesthetic awareness and just being able to do those things. But yeah, that's really it. I just want to get them into a position that's not inhibited for some reason and load the quads. And that's a great way to do it.
Yeah. With what you said about the torso, I've been relearning a little bit about that myself with the sandbag squats, which is almost like it's almost like like emphasizes the torso even more than the legs, just because eventually you can't hold the weight.
Yeah, exactly.
But I found just exclusively sandbag squatting for a period of time with usually heels elevated too,
Yeah.
just because if I didn't, it turns into more of a good morning because the weight is so far in front of you, or
Yeah.
it easily
Yeah.
can, or you have to go really wide with your stance.
Yeah.
And I find that my like obliques and like all those muscles in that area get noticeably bigger and stronger, which for me, like if I went back to track in college as a high jumper, I don't think I would want that, just because that's weight I
Yeah.
don't need. But
Yeah.
if you just want to be strong and strong on the bar and you don't want to hurt your back and you want to have that pressure. And I
Yeah.
was thinking about what the recent podcast Michael Bruno talked about, the diaphragm pressurization, the strength of the diaphragm even being a very defining factor in how fast we
Yeah.
can reverse things.
Yeah.
And that's like something sometimes, we only look at strength as one piece. And to me, if you would have said torso strength to me 10 years ago or 20, I might have said like abs and obliques and spinal erectors. But
Right.
it's also like how powerfully can you pressurize that system
Yeah.
underneath. And that's why I value, I feel like you get that certainly with the Zerchers more than like a back squat even
Yeah, for sure.
as a good primer.
That's it, because we want it to be like almost subconscious, where they're not actively, because that's it from like a specificity standpoint. I'm just trying to train the torso to be really good when we handle loads in the back squat. Like I'm not looking for carryover within
Yeah.
the sport within this specific idea, because again, like most of our periodization of systems are predicated on your ability to back squat really well. So yeah, like, we try to like obviously just subconsciously have the ability to train the torso. It's a seamless carryover. And then the other thing, like within the Zercher, and you're like protracting those shoulder blades out, and the amount of like stress you get within the upper back and in the
Yes.
rhomboids, that's probably like the area most kids like feel it the most within those first 3 weeks. Because again, most people probably like really underdeveloped between the shoulder blades, and then you put this large eccentric like load on there that they're not really thinking about, but then that's like the most taxing thing for most people. So if like, again, if that's something you value, like big protraction and getting like eccentric load on the rhomboids, another reason to Zercher.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's because a lot of people, you have like on one hand, you have like very traditional extension pattern lifting, like butt back, chest out, which is the opposite. It's concentric squeezing of the shoulder blades. And I
Yes,
find,
yeah.
I know this is true in myself, and because it's true in myself, I look for it in athletes now pretty regularly, especially in high jump, because if your shoulders are tight or any jumping event in track and sprints as well, although it's in a particular premium with the jumps because they're a little looser and more three-dimensional in high jump at least. And so I look for the shoulder tightness. And if it's constantly pin your shoulders back, raise them up, you almost start, I know I did for sure. Like I watched a video of myself high jumping last year and I have all this just crazy neck and face tension. And I've always had that issue a little bit. But that's one of those nice things. If you get that nice Zercher hold, it's like intentionally letting those shoulder blades stretch and almost, they're not down regulating per se, but they're getting length, they're getting activated in the length patterning. And I just think that even I think of that even in arm swing in a jump. Like there was
100%.
some guy, it was in one of the I think the dunk camps, like vert contest things, and they had like the bells, which is awesome. I love that little bell trainer thing. I want one of those. Maybe I get them to sponsor the show. It's like the coolest thing. But this guy who jumped like 50.5 maybe. It's funny because I'll watch a guy like that jump, and I watch the arm swing. And Jordan Kilganone does it too. Particularly, like those are two guys I can really see it show up in. I'm sure everybody who jumps high off two legs does it to some extent, but I almost look now, I wouldn't call it a KPI, but I like to look at how low do their hands swing relative to the ground when they take off. And this guy who jumped 50.5, his hands were like, I mean, he almost scraped the ground. I shouldn't say he almost scraped the ground, but it's like this long, low swing. And I that kind of hit home to me. It was I was at an Evolve Move Play retreat, and it was Aaron Cantor leading the warm up, and it was a bunch of weird hippie stuff. Like if people saw us, it was like, what are these fools doing out in the grass? And one of the things was just arm swings, and you could just Google or YouTube like Qigong arm swings. Like you're just kind of like letting your arms go loose and swing back and forth. And he would do that for 5 minutes, and I would slowly start to feel. The cueing was just like let your arms go totally dead weight, like take all the tension out. If you've seen like Pavel's fast and loose stuff, they'll do like kind of swinging to the side and like your arms hit you. But after about my 3rd minute into that series and doing that, I started to feel like my shoulders finally relaxed, and I got this extra little kind of surge wave in my arms and shoulders that I didn't feel before. And the first thing that came to mind was how Jordan swings his arms in the jump. Like, it's just this, it's such a long whip. His upper back almost does this like extra surge to it. And I think
Yeah,
Jake Tura may have,
that's
or somebody
interesting.
may have had
I never really
yeah,
thought about that because I do know like when we're cueing like technical things in the approach, like we're really emphasizing like striking down on the
yeah,
ground with like the block leg coming
mhm,
around, trying to. But I've never looked specifically. Now I'm gonna like think about this next time we're jump testing and like looking for how deep the arm swing is getting for like our highest jumpers relative to
yeah,
like our. But hey, maybe it is a KPI. I'm sure there will be and it's something we emphasize. But another thing with like the Zercher, kind of going back to this idea of like, we try to really emphasize like, again, the shoulder blades moving across the rib cage. And a lot of people,
mhm,
like you're saying, like this classic just extension, like contracting the shoulder blades together. And there's like no posterior expansion within the rib cage. And then it makes it really hard for these shoulder blades just to like naturally glide when you like go into that concave, convex kind of
mhm,
idea of what the rib cage should be. So it allows us, especially when we're doing like extensive pauses maybe in the bottom and we're like actively telling them to like inhale and exhale through their upper back and create space there, because that's a big point of emphasis again if you're like from like an arm health standpoint, just
yes,
general awareness of the shoulder blade. Those things need to move nicely across the rib cage, but sometimes it isn't the shoulder blade, it's the rib cage and there's no posterior expansion and you just have this really flat rib cage and that's why it's really tough. So yeah, another reason, again, we'll just try to add reasons to Zercher, to really expand the posterior side of the ribcage.
yeah, yeah. With that heel elevated fat bar, I think that's almost. Well, it's funny to think even like a bench press. Like, where did that come about? Well, because someone had to get it from the ground up to their, to a pressing position back in 1900, so it could be counted for.
Yeah,
It's like we take for granted why these lifts we like are there. And I think about, well, now we have the means very easily, like a slant board, even putting plates under your heels and fat
right.
grips to do something that's more biomechanically advantageous.
Exactly.
And I find, for myself, going and I'll flip flop these variations around in my own programming. Like yourself, I tend to go a lot heavier on Zercher. If a client has a sandbag, I'll program that or encourage it. I do a lot of front squat, but I agree with you. I think a lot of athletes, especially with shoulder flexion values that aren't great, they can really they just lack the ability to lift the elbows up, and so it's like you could just keep telling them that you could just
Yeah,
keep saying it, or you could just give them something else.
exactly.
So
That's how
I
I got
get
to
that.
this point. The same reason. Like we'll still front squat. I think there's value in that skill. Um, but yeah, I've just come to value the Zercher so much more for that exact reason. Because most anybody's gonna have an issue with the front rack position because who's been in that position unless you're like an Olympic weightlifter. So especially these kids that are coming in to train, like freshmen, even transfers, like yeah, I don't want to. Again, no waste of time. So
Yeah.
sometimes we got to axe the front squat for most people.
Yeah, I agree with what you said about the posterior expansion too, because any overhead athlete, I mean, and I did plenty. I mean, I got away with it, and I think you can easily get away with it. But like, I think more too about getting that elbow up if you're already are limited with expansion, posterior expansion in the upper
Yeah,
back, and you really just crank it, you're just
yeah,
compressing that area.
yeah.
And wouldn't it be better to just do something that lets you decompress it and lengthen it and get some air in there, and that'll help your overhead actions too. So
Yes,
it's kind of a
exactly.
double win. But the back squat, it's funny because I think sometimes you can go down biomechanics rabbit holes and it's like, oh man, the back squat's so extension biased and all this
Yeah,
stuff. But I'll go back to it. Like I when I was rock climbing this winter, and I'll still program it for clients too, especially maybe more like the full range stuff is always like Zercher in front, heels elevated and goblet and all those traditional things.
mhm,
Usually when I get to back, a lot of it's like 2/3 or do a box or something. But I'll go back to just full back squats myself. So just so I don't get, kind of too like jaded against it, like just not too
yeah,
opinionated. Because it's funny
yeah,
when I go back to back squatting after a bunch of sandbags and Zercher stuff, I feel my hamstrings way more. It actually
yeah.
becomes a different lift than what it was historically, which was a lot
Interesting.
more like quads, but outer quads a lot,
Yeah,
a little bit more back. Just and a lot of that also the pressure. I think I didn't have the pressure gradient running through the
yeah,
internal system to
yeah,
really create that either.
yeah. We like I said, like our for like right now we're in our off season, coming up on the end, and like our whole off season's predicated on like just honestly using weight releasers. And for us, like getting a ton of like eccentric loads specifically on the quads, And I think this is the best like apparatus for us to do it within my environment. Like all of this is just to do the back squat.
Yeah.
So it's really the only reason we're using the back squat exclusively is for that idea to use overload eccentrics with weight releasers. And then I think it's like also just nice and how like understand the skill of having the bar on the back. And for like some variations that we'll have the bar on the back, but maybe it's not a squat. Maybe it's some sort of like counter movement jump variation with the bar on the back, or some kind of like rhythm squat or partial range of motion, inertia style, overcoming it, like all those things. Like, so it's nice to have a familiarity with having the bar on the back, and like you're saying, the different lines of tension within the torso and the quads, and how, but yeah, outside of that, the only reason we're back squatting is to use weight releasers. Like I could definitely use it within a front squat. Well, I've done it with a Zercher before, but I think again, going front loaded, the torso is a limiting factor. It inhibits the ability to put the load we want on the quads.
Yeah.
So hence why we're still using the back squat.
Yeah. Well, that's why I thought. I mean, like I said, back when I was like high jumping or all the triple jump, javelin, and whatnot in college, I think the back squat was a better choice for me back then, simply because, I mean, I guess javelin, I could make the argument easily. But for the other jumping events, torso strength was not the limiting factor. It's just stronger legs and stimulus, especially like even a partial back squat. It's just good. It's more stimulating than a deep front squat, and it's more legs. So yeah absolutely. One thing I do want to ask you, and it is interesting how our context, our landscape of coaching changes things. I mean, I'm having more and more conversations about the new college landscape, and 1 year and you transfer. But if you, let's just say you had a group and it was hypothetical, and you had kids for 4 years, and would you change, or might you change like a freshman or that kind of thing if you knew you had them for 4 years? Any thoughts on that? Like more like single leg, or I was gonna ask you about single leg variations. I haven't seen too many of those in your program, but stuff like that.
Well, okay, I'll answer the single leg really quick. As far as like in our off season, we don't do a ton of variation. Like I said, just again, macro goal. One thing that's going to yield the most results for us is like the eccentric, and then that hence puts us in these overloaded eccentrics with the weight releasers. But we do a ton of single leg as we get in season. So for us, we we're training every day we play volleyball. So it's like 5 days a week, probably. So we structure like 2 upper body days, 2 lower body days, and then a day on the court. And so on those 2 lower body days, we're probably back squatting and Zercher squatting. And then once we get in season, that changes a ton. So we'll do a ton of true single leg work. I really value the idea of just, again, true single leg squatting, pistol squatting, high box, triple jumper step ups, that kind of deal from the awareness standpoint. And it allows us to still maintain this like flow within these deep end ranges. So I've come to that, like that's where I get most of my single leg work. Again, it just becomes a give and take of what's more important to me, which is jumping as high as possible. So it's like, I got to cut some things, but as far as like going to this idea of like a 4 year, I kind of view it like in the same way. Maybe you look at like an Olympic weightlifting cycle, as far as like we have this full thought out macro 52 week plan. Like here's what our off season looks like. Here's what our preseason, and then our in season is obviously very varied depending on travel and all these things. But we have these underlying goals within these macro cycles. And then for us, it's just, we're going to keep rerunning this macro cycle year after year, and just, obviously variations change depending on like where my mindset is, but for the most part, the end goals stay the same, and like the adaptations we're driving stay the same. And from there, we're just progressively overloading within year after year, as far as like maybe intensities. Maybe it's a kid that couldn't do a full chin up, now is doing full chin ups. Maybe like from it's just minor nuances like that. But very classic Olympic weightlifting style, just repeat year after year and keep stacking those until it doesn't yield a stimulus anymore. And I think the nice thing about college athletics is most all of these kids are severely undertrained, where it's hard you could really get away with doing the same thing over and over, and you're going to continue to yield a stimulus, whether it's neural or structural or even just like a skill. Maybe they're just getting better at the skill. So for us, we keep it really simple. They'll just keep compounding it, the same thing year after year. If it continues to yield results for us, if it doesn't, then we'll start to change. But I will say I haven't trained anybody for 4 years yet. So when the time comes.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Lila Exogen Wearable Resistance. Exogen is used by coaches such as Randy Huntington and Chris Corfist and is an incredible tool in overloading the angular momentum and speed aspect of human movement. You can get 25% off of Exogen sleeves by heading to lilateam.com and using the code JustFly25. Yeah. It'll be interesting too, maybe coming back in 4 years or seeing like anything like that with the progression. But for sure, like I mentioned right when we started, it's a very powerful training system. It's something that, I think about all the different ways you can stimulate an athlete. And I think it was interesting. I think you said this on a different podcast too. You alluded to the idea, and you see it a lot where people are switching lift variations every 4 weeks. And I think it doesn't, I think that's not to say everyone's going from like, hey, we're going to go from a back squat to a pistol to then we're going to do it. Yeah, I think there's the similar rotation, but it does seem like yours just very constantly centers around, we're going to get your legs as strong as we can and not stray too far from these core patterns. Like we're always trying to come back to this core pattern. And yeah, I again, not to say like, I guess you could draw up any spectrum of how often people are switching stuff up, but it seems like yours would err towards the side of not switching things up much from a raw pattern perspective, but it's more that the tempos are changing and all those other pieces are changing around it.
That's it. Like we just have like from like the patterning, lifting, like things in my head that are probably like the biggest range of motion movements that are probably gonna, from a structural standpoint, involve the most amount of contractile tissue. And that allows us to have this massive bandwidth of things that are happening. And again, at the end of the day, like the biggest bang for your buck, I hesitate to use that term from a movement standpoint within the weight room, but just large ranges of motion things that I think yield the most results. And and then it allows us, like you're saying, to have a ton of variation off these movements. And for most of the time for us, it's varying tempos, contraction types, velocities. And I think that's really where the frequency and change comes from. Because when you're trying to drive like specific adaptation, like the biomechanics kind of govern that. It's not necessarily the movement patterns unless you're getting into like specific transfer, which we're not going to do that in the weight room for the most part. That's going to be predicated on our days where we're on the court. Because again, just like for us, the technical skill of jumping, we're not going to really address a ton of that within just training. We'll have a day predicated just towards that. But within the weight room, we'll keep it really simple. The movements that are going to be the biggest ranges of motion that we can probably vary within tempos, contraction types, velocities, even ranges of motion within those movements. That's where the frequency of change comes from. Because there is like like squatting, doing a chin up, pressing is all a skill. And like any skill, frequency is probably king when trying to learn a skill. So if I want them to be really good squatters for the time we're back, like we're doing weight releasers, I have to hammer that skill. So frequency and doing it 2-3 times a week, the same thing over and over, just hammering that skill. So when I do need that skill to be not the limiting factor, it isn't. So I don't know a ton of variation within the weight room. I just don't think for what we're trying to accomplish that it's important. Maybe if I was working with maybe young kids where I'm trying to create this bandwidth of awareness, maybe. But for us, we're looking to drive a really specific adaptation, specifically in contractile tissue and connective tissue, and jump as high as possible. So if I'm varying too many things, I'm not giving all to this one adaptation and I'm spreading it thin elsewhere. I may yield a result that's minimal, but I want to yield the best result possible. So that's kind of how I've gotten to this point, maybe, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I've seen you use a lot of your athletes doing a lot of very deep squat end range type. Either they're just hitting it on the way to their the total lift or they're staying there. But it makes me think about I experienced this, I guess you could say viscerally, my junior year of high school when I got stuck in my basement under it. It was just 225 on the squat bar, but I got stuck and I was there for like, I don't know, 30 seconds or a minute. And when I finally got out from under it, I found like my body felt much different than a typical set, but in a good, like in a really good way, like in a very uniquely activated way. And that always stuck with me. And I remember there were the times that I'd intentionally just taken squats, and this was flat-footed, but as deep as I could. There's kind of this unique kind of kick in hip extension you get the next day that, and that's where I'd be curious, your perspective on that interplay between deep squats, very deep squats, and by that I mean like a deep squat, like parallel max, max leverage from where the thigh is perspective, max tension, all the way down, max muscle length, and then partials. Like, do you do that just with isometrics? Do you do it with moving barbells? Tell me a little bit about those components that you're programming.
Yeah, we'll do a lot of partial stuff, specifically like in our preseason kind of summertime leading up into our volleyball season. But like in our off season, like again, going like health is a player that we want to train. And I think you can maybe mitigate some things by getting into end ranges and making tissues and like these contractile elements, like be able to handle the bandwidth of taking on or producing forces will always expand the bandwidth to handle chaos probably. Because I mean, people have said this all the time. Like if you never train that position and get exposed to it, especially under velocity, something probably isn't probably going to happen. So, especially in our off season, we try to keep everything through these deep ranges of motion where we're exposing the contractile tissue through its fullest range and not just load, but maybe it's eccentric load, then maybe the ability to produce pure concentric force and like contractile tissue just shortening with no leveraging of momentum. Or maybe it's the other way around and putting a ton of velocity on contractile tissue and making like these inhibitors, like the muscle spindles contract in these lengthened positions and understand what it's like to leverage momentum out of those deep end ranges of motion. So the idea is just have a massive bandwidth to handle chaos. So I think if you can get into those deep end ranges and not just produce force, but various forces, whether it's leveraging momentum, velocity, pure concentric, like contractile tissue contracting, I think on paper, it sounds like it'll probably help you create a larger bandwidth. It's hard to really quantify that. But it kind of makes sense from that idea. But then as we get like closer to our season, just moving general to specific, we'll do a lot of, well, right now we're doing overcoming isometrics, but since we're still in our off season, we're getting into our deep end ranges. So this first week, we're in the bottom of the squat, doing like an 8-second overcoming isometric. And the thought processes here is you're getting into the most mechanically disadvantageous position to contract, and the sarcomere's inability to contract and produce force. Because the idea is the body does not produce enough force to overcome inertia within that position. So it should signal some sort of adaptation of whether it's usually probably going to be, I need more sarcomeres here in this deep end range of motion to overcome this inertia. So we do overcoming isometrics and deep end ranges for that idea of promoting an adaptation of probably adding contractile tissue. But then that's more of like for a structural adaptation kind of deal. And then there's like, you can bias towards the neural side, and getting into these specific positions of more shallow angles and, whether it's shorter duration, overcoming isometrics of 3 seconds, maybe complexing it out. We will do those things, especially as we get closer to the preseason. Where I do think from a transfer effect of like trying to get within the range of angles you're probably working in probably has some value. So we'll do it for that reason. But a lot of times, like right now, we're getting same when we're using overcoming isometrics, for example, I really like it in the deep end ranges of motion. Because again, like I said, the signaling for more contractile tissue to be able to produce more force in that end range. But then there's just some sort of, I'm sure there's like a neural effect of like creating awareness at that joint in that end range. If inhibition is like a limiting factor, maybe that's a great way to apply force because there's no dynamic movement. So if like patellar tendon pain, like we all know like isometrics are great, especially like high force isometrics. So if there's an inhibition, like that's a great way to get high force in with maybe out the negative connotation of like it's too stressful for that individual. But yeah, time and place. We'll get into more shallow, partial range, inertia style squatting, overcoming isometrics as we just get closer to playing.
Yeah. You got me thinking, Anthony, about just the isometric phase, because there's almost two ways you can run that isometric. And I've seen it with like the 3-phase squats that you've posted where it's like, and I remember doing that. I think it was Michael Yessis that posted that way back in the day. I mean, I have a video.
Yeah, what's old is new.
Yeah, I was doing that back when I first started like this whole website and this whole thing in 2012, like just doing like a tick, 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 3 positions. But you got me thinking about the difference between, a lot of times we just hold the iso at the sticking point. So maybe that's parallel or just above parallel because that's what you would overcome for the lift. But there's also like just the raw physiological side, like you're saying, like sarcomeres in series. Like, what if you go below the sticking point?
Yeah,
And that reminds me of like Jay Schrader's extreme isometrics or Christian
exactly.
Thibaudeau's like loaded stretching. And I would say that there's probably, for just a pure generalist adaptation, like we're not even talking about specific neural programs, but just the
Yeah,
tissues and then your ability to do whatever you want,
that's
that I would
exactly
actually
it.
value the deepest hold,
Yeah,
in the same way
yeah,
you do a nice extreme iso with load or something like that.
that's exactly it. And I've always like in my head, like if you're really like first, we'll kind of stay on the squat. If you're really strong in the bottom of the squat in the deepest end range, you're probably going to make like the top is going to get stronger.
Mm-hmm.
It does not work vice versa. Like if you're only training the top range and you're never exposing yourself in those end ranges, that's always going to be the limiting factor. But if you get really strong in those deep end range lengthened positions and your nervous system's really efficient there and you have contractile there to shorten, you'll be okay. And again, the bandwidth, having a massive bandwidth, that's really my general only premise is I want to have this massive bandwidth to handle force and also produce force. So you got to get into the most unleveraged positions and train them.
Yeah. It makes me think too about, I think about, I try to relate some of this stuff in my mind. I'm trying to integrate like Bill Hartman's ideas and some of the biomechanics coming out to some of these things. And that sticking point iso, it's almost more training your ability to internally rotate and reverse. But
Yeah.
for some people, you don't want to be there too long if you're like a speed jumper, But if you go down
Yeah.
all the way, it's
Yeah.
actually different. It's almost you're going back to early stance. It's like you start at
Yeah.
early stance, you go to that mid stance IR, and then you actually go down to the bottom. You're back in almost a different phase.
Yeah.
And I know for me, I mean, I've gotten good squat and vertical jump gains from doing like the sticking point
Uh-huh.
pauses, but as like almost my elasticity in terms of like high jump ability, think like just that raw like whippiness, almost the
Yeah.
bottom for me. I feel like that was a in a way, not that I did a lot of from what I did do, and I'm just thinking about it. Your system's making me have all these old memories of that because that's something where. I mean, I think I get most of my stretch range work now through like, isometric lunge holds and
Yeah.
those ideas.
Yeah.
But I've forgotten what it's like to get stapled at the bottom of a squat and have to hold it there for that
Yeah.
extended period of time. What
It's a
that felt like.
different stimulus,
Yeah.
that's for sure.
Yeah.
I will say, like, uniquely getting into the bottom, you would think, oh, your quads. Like, I feel like your hip extensor is
Yes.
working
Big time.
a lot more.
Yeah.
Because like you're saying, getting into that ER kind of phase of when you're like pushing into the ground, your hip extensors are working a ton. Obviously, your
Yeah.
quads are getting a stimulus, but your hip extensors are getting something they probably never had
Yes.
before. And then, like you're saying, carrying it over into the following day, you have this sensation in your hip extension. And that's one thing I think kind of gets demonized, is this idea of training for sensation and looking to like just feel things, Sometimes that's really important, especially in learning a skill. And like you're saying, maybe it's carrying it over into a more specific skill where maybe you have somebody struggling with projection and getting the knee behind the pelvis. If that's a stimulus that allows them to feel hip extension a little more and it carries it over, like, great, we'll keep doing it if that helps you. But yeah, uniquely, the bottom of the squat really drives a unique hip extension sensation.
Yeah. You made me, you mentioned Tim Karen. I think he's a big Poliquin guy.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about, Poliquin's like, I picture, and then Poliquin, you got like Ben Patrick stuff with like the end range split squat stuff and whatnot. And it does, it's certainly been around in different forms, but
Yes,
you definitely
sure
got me
has.
thinking about, sitting at the bottom, like the deep bottom of a bilateral now.
Yeah.
I think sometimes if I try to do it with a rear foot elevated, like sometimes people who, it can be, in some ways, I mean, I've definitely used RFE stretches, but a lot of people get like cranked out, like hip flexors in the back leg a little bit sometimes, especially if they're not ready for it. And so if you lack internal rotation in a leg, like you can compensate to get, I think it's a good movement without question, but I'm actually kind of comparing that now in my head to a bilateral. So you got my wheels turning, but I think it's something that I've actually not thought about for a long time. So I'm making connections with what you have the girls doing in their squat pattern.
Yeah, I will say with those like overcoming isos in the deep ranges, like you can do overcoming isos sub-maximally for extensive time. Like not everything has to be maximal. So for us, like I'm saying, when we're looking for structural changes, we extend these times out like up to 20 seconds. Like within single reps. Obviously, you're not pushing maximally for 20 seconds. It's pretty sub-max. But specifically when we're working in those deep end ranges, we're working pretty sub-maximal for extensive time. And then again, as we get taller, range of motion gets smaller, the time gets shorter, the force gets higher kind of deal.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I think has always been when people talk about the Olympic lifts. And I was going to ask you about that because I don't think that's in. You mentioned if you're not going to do a front squat, I think I
Yeah,
already know the answer,
yeah,
which makes perfect sense. But I think about people talk about, oh, the Olympic pole and all these things trying to dissect Olympic pole and compare it, put a velocity
yeah,
tag on it and compare it to other movements. And there's definitely something there. But
yeah,
I think the catching Olympic lift deep, and it's funny because those are almost most notorious. You see those like fail videos or like some high schooler is trying to clean
yeah.
300 and just gets under it somehow magically and just twists his way up with it.
Yes,
But
yeah,
but there's as I've seen it, like the funny thing is you would look at that and be like, oh man, that's such a bad thing. But I look at it like, yeah, that's not a great way to lift 100%. But how athletic for that athlete to dive under that
very.
bar and get the expansion in the hips needed to do so, and then find a way to compensate and problem solve to lift. I would not recommend doing it that way, but that was very athletic to be able to do that.
Yeah,
And I think about a deep Olympic lift catch. Again, that took me a long, even when I started my journey as a strength coach, I was not good at deep Olympic lift
yeah,
catching. It took me a while to get there. But once I got it, I was like, yeah, I really like and I really like this. And I was thinking about, there's a video I feel like I should put in the show notes. So it was a high jumper. His name was Tora Harris, and he was high jumping back when I was in college. I think he was a few years ahead of me. Jumping well. He was one of the US's top guys at 7'8.5", I think he
mm,
was. And he had a training compilation with a lot of jumps, but he was also doing Olympic lifts. And he was catching snatches like rock bottom. And it's funny because you would think, oh, high jumper,
he's gonna catch a high.
why do you need to train that range? And I think it actually relates a lot to what you were saying with like, the deep range and then that early stance. It's actually the most expansive way you can catch it. And like you said, it stimulates the hip extensors and the glutes in a way that they wouldn't be if you caught it
Yeah,
higher. And it's also, I think, too, for a high jumper and advanced athlete, that's a fun coordination challenge with
yeah.
the gift of a deep, like expansive catch at the end. So, yeah, a lot of those memories coming back with that. But I imagine, yeah, you probably don't use Olympic lifts with all that in mind in the time frame you have.
No, yeah. I actually come from an Olympic lifting
Yeah.
background. My first internship trained Olympic lifts extensively. And I think I didn't get really good. I was okay, better than average, like human for sure. Um, so going into like training, my GA, definitely use Olympic lifts. And it just the time component
Yeah.
is always a limiting factor for them to be as proficient as you want. I think you can get away with values in the pools. I think there's some value there. But like for us, again, just going into like what's our end goal with
Hmm.
driving a ton of eccentric stimulus, which I think there can be value in the catch. Um, but again, there's a whole technical component that is
Oh,
not in
yeah.
play there that needs to be thought about. It just, yeah, I've just cut it out. I've gotten great results with and without. It just works best for us in my scenario without it.
Yeah. And your kids are obviously jumping really high. So I don't think you're missing
Genetics
too
help.
much by not having that in there.
Yeah,
It makes me think too, like for a track athlete, like a high jumper like that, to catch a deep full snatch. It's like if you're track, your sport is more singular movements
yeah,
and the appreciation of singular movements. And not that a volleyball player couldn't do that, but you go out and play volleyball and you have a ton of highly skilled movements you already need to be
yeah,
good at on the court. So I mean, you could do that stuff in the weight room, but when you already have so
yeah.
many skills, I think it also changes the way that you think about what you really need to do at
Yeah,
any given time.
that's it. I think interestingly, you could address this more than I can, but I think Olympic lifts and track and field, like it's always like subconsciously like it's a necessity.
Hmm.
So when they're training those lifts, there's probably a lot more value and intent within the track and field community to be really proficient within those lifts. Whereas like maybe any other athlete, they absolutely hate them unless they're really good at them,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is far and few.
yeah. It's definitely a cultural thing in track and field for sure. And
Yeah,
I mean, I think I kind of ended up like in my time in swim, like we use them a lot. It could become cultural, and
yeah,
if you have a lot of time over 4 years and things like that, but if you can get great results and you don't need them, in some ways, there's like that's a skill in and of itself. And even for myself, like I mentioned, I go back to back squats periodically just to not get like
yeah,
too against them because it's like no, these are very stimulating, and I should learn how to make this lift as good as I can. But also for me, taking time away from Olympic lifting, and I'll take
yeah,
even in track athletes programs, I will intentionally deprive them of Olympic lifts for periods of the year just because I
yeah,
think that sometimes it's good to work on these hip extension patterns without an Olympic lift in the picture because I don't know, just to kind of get it out of the way for a little bit. I always think it's a good thing. So it's a nice it's nice to be able to get results in different ways and with different focus points.
Yeah, there's definitely obviously 1,000 ways to do a thing. What I love about this field is it's completely lawless. You can do whatever you want and probably yield a result. But sometimes just yielding a result isn't good enough. It's like who's going to yield the best result. And it's very contextual and like environmentally based and what your situation is. And yeah, just our situation doesn't call for Olympic lifts.
Yeah. I do want to ask you one more methodology or movement exercise question before we talk a little bit about, how throughout the year, how you work in the different phases. But in terms of warm-ups, training movement, like movement options, crawls, and just different ways to train. I saw a video where you were doing all sorts of different like rolls, and I saw like some Tim Anderson air rolls in there. I'm trying to think of, there's like some low deep leaps and those kind of things. And I think you on another podcast, you had like a term for a workout where you're doing like everything or something. Because I like to think about, I know we're going to talk a lot about, very intense stimulating methods, but I did want to talk about the other side just briefly with like, what about movement potential and more, and I'm sure stuff that probably mitigates the stress of a lot of like intensive stuff and prepares you for it too. So tell me a little bit about, some of the multilateral movement training you do in your programming.
Yeah, we term it gymnastics.
Yeah.
So it's a
very novel concept.
I got a lot of this stuff. If you've ever remember YouTube, maybe like 10 years ago, like Valhalla Performance, and this guy would do a lot of like animal crawling
stuff.
Yeah,
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I know that guy.
So that's where the idea originally sparked from. And I really value the idea of like kinesthetic awareness more so than anything else. I think just from like a skill acquisition standpoint, if you're really aware of your body, it makes skill acquisition a little easier, I think. You can kind of see this all the time with like a kid that's only played one sport, and then you try to get them to bend their knees. It's impossible. But I think in the idea of kinesthetic awareness, like gymnasts are probably the most aware of their bodies within this idea of athletics, the things they're doing. So it's just like success leaves clues. Let's take very remedial ideas of gymnastics. Maybe you would do with like a kindergartner or your 4-year-old, you put them in early gymnastics and just apply that within our setting in some capacity. So within our warm-ups, we'll do a ton of like these crawling variations. We'll do a lot of like back bridging, handstand, all these just very like fun, you're playing. So I love it for the idea of just creating awareness in your body. From a warm-up standpoint, it's just a lot more engaging for the kid, I think, than just like your stereotypical dynamic warm-up, drill 10 yards, kind of deal. And I think you can get a lot more out of it. So yeah, we'll add a ton of variations. That's the thing where it's like completely free play. There's not a thought out system and progression. Like we're just going to see where it takes us and like, just have fun with it. Let your body be free. So I love that from a warm up standpoint. If one day somebody ever lets me design a weight room, I'm not putting turf in, I'm putting gymnastics mats in. That's like for sure. And then for like going into like the deep tier plyometrics, like we'll kind of do at the end of those gymnastic sessions. So we're usually doing those on a lower body day with, we're squatting probably. And that's a great, just again, the idea of adding velocity within the in ranges under a little bit of control. Going back to this idea of like if there's inhibition within knee flexion, that's a great way to maybe start mitigating some inhibition if they're able to get in that range of motion at all. And I think there's just a ton of value within just getting into deep end ranges and playing and having awareness of your body. And that's really it. Like, especially within my population of like 6'4" kids that probably never bent their knees anyways, to get them on the ground is very unique. But I will say, like, anecdotally, like our highest jumping athletes are probably the best gymnastics kids we have. As far as like, they probably have a background in like cheer and dance. And so that makes this so much easier as we transition to these things. But then again, going back to the idea of skill acquisition and them able to like grasp the skill of how to squat how we want, or like if we're coaching technically within the penultimate stuff, they grasp these concepts so much faster. So I think it goes to show there's a lot of value in just like, we all know this at this point, I hope, in just playing free play and gymnastics. So that's really the idea there.
Yeah. I like how that extensive range, I like how that idea, the extensive range concept also goes into the gymnastic movements, because I think it is in those end ranges where there's also a lot of like the maximal requirement of body awareness, and then even mitigation of fear a little bit, and the ability to manipulate yourself in the air. And I've posted this before. I love watching the it's not Dunk Elite. It was like one of those teams. I think it was Team Flight Brothers back when they first started, and it was like, for people who remember, it was like the Worm and Mr. 720 and T-Dub and those guys. And after some show, they're all just doing backflips. And I think they're probably all self-taught, like not just backflips, like back handsprings, cartwheels into back handsprings. I think someone threw a twist in there, and it's unbelievable. Like, and to me, that is like, yeah, like you said, those kids have a movement capacity that runs deeper than other people do, and they can solve. Yeah. And it's such a, having my own kids, I'm always looking for like, it's interesting to see the differences in my own children. And yeah, that stuff is really, it's fun too. Yeah, and I would love to get. I've been meaning to get like stall bars, like the ones you see in the 1980s.
Oh yeah, I would
like
love some
in my basement. Like that's the thing too, that I don't know why that died out. Like, it's like, we're going to build out our weight room and we're going to do this, and like, where's the stall bars? Like,
stall bars, a trampoline, European trampoline, something along those lines. I will say, like, we have my too bad, like, going back to like ripping out a backflip, probably the best athlete I've ever trained as a female. She had graduated this past year, playing professional. One day after gymnastics session, she just rips out like an aerial. Yeah. Which is like, she's like, oh, I've never done this before. And we're just like, what in the world? And this kid is like an elite jumper, obviously. And then same thing now, we have a kid that's new to us this year who's going to be a sophomore. And she's will probably go down as the best athlete I ever trained in my whole career. She's a 2-time state champion shot putter in the state of Texas. Oh, wow. She did like gymnastics and dance until she was like 12 years old. But she's also like, looks like she could play defensive line for our football team tomorrow. And she's like just an elite mover. Like, she gets into positions like our liberos or our like little kids cannot even dream to get into. And I think it comes down to this idea of just like the gymnastics. I'm so in on this concept of like getting young kids early into that stuff, because I think there's so much value later on down the road in their athletic career.
Yeah, Jeremy Frisch says he's went through 3 trampolines. His family's went through 3 trampolines. So I think that's a must to develop, just because that's like the safest place to develop those qualities too. And it's funny to think about, all the trampolines now have like the safety cages. And when I was growing up, that was like, what, that person has a safety cage? Like,
yeah, it was the coolest thing.
Yeah. It's so it was so odd in the 90s, but it's funny to actually imagine my kids jumping on one without one now in some ways. So awesome. Well, hey, let's talk a little bit about some of the contraction types, because I know that's a really big thing that you do, is just going beyond standard sets and reps and infusing those throughout the year. So tell me a little bit, just briefly, maybe a brief overview on how throughout the year, how does the emphasis shift? So from starting off season, preseason, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I kind of got this idea from Tim Karen in his book, The Strength Deficit. I've always kind of biased training contraction type, but this allowed me to like really systemize it. So I'm looking in the world of like just jumping. I want to jump as high as possible, and there's obviously a big player within the stretch shortening cycle. And so it's like, how can I make the most efficient stretch shortening cycle as possible? And there's a big thing is just having a massive amount of like potential energy. And then obviously you need to be efficient enough to turn over that potential energy. And so I kind of just connected like an eccentric contraction, potential energy, and then we'll train the amerization somewhere. So it's like, if I can create the most amount of potential energy, create this massive amount of pool of energy, and then just get efficient enough to carry over that energy within just specifically in jumping in the stretch shortening cycle, in theory, I was like, okay, they should start jumping a lot higher. And then just going like this general idea of training, the eccentric contraction is just so severely undertrained relative to the concentric contraction, because most traditional training within the weight room is going to bias concentric adaptations of just moving load or moving load faster. And we all kind of understand the eccentric is much stronger than the concentric, but since we're limited to concentric ability, we're always training the eccentric very submaximally, which there's value there. But again, if we're wanting to create more potential energy, you have to give the eccentric maybe a stimulus so it can adapt and create a larger pool. So in our off season, it's all about just honing in on the eccentric contraction and making it as efficient as possible. So we start off within the first 4 to 6 weeks of just training some maximal eccentrics, accumulating time. And a lot of it's just like skill acquisition within these patterns. And we kind of understand like slow eccentrics is a great teaching tool within these. But for us, it's just trying to create awareness. So slowing down the movement, especially with like the 3 position pauses and feel sensations there and drive that, in a sense, just creating awareness and getting really good at the skill. So submaximal eccentrics. But it's a nice precursor for when we move into what we're in now with these overloaded maximal eccentrics. Because you don't want to go cold turkey into max eccentrics. Probably something not good is probably going to happen. So it's just prepping the nervous system and the contractile tissue for what we really want to do, which is overload the eccentric. And maybe not necessarily overloaded, but overloaded relative to the concentric. So we'll work 6 weeks of weight releasers, where we're kind of using Christian Thibodeau's idea of like maximal eccentrics and super maximal eccentrics and kind of following his outlines of percentages. So for us, I don't care about concentric output in any capacity. So how we kind of assess this is, obviously we have force plates. So we'll kind of do a counter movement jump, and we're going to really just hone in on modified RSI and then true RSI with the drop jump, because I think that's going to give us the best indication of the stretch shortening cycle's efficiency. And if those are changing over time and compounding with jumping higher on the vertex, we can kind of, in theory, something's working without us honing in on just concentric contraction. So you could probably speculate that the eccentric's getting more efficient. And within that, you're creating a more efficient stretch shortening cycle, hopefully. Because that's the end macro goal. I just want to create an efficient stretch shortening cycle. And first step is just get as much potential energy as we can. So that's where the eccentric comes in. And then going back to this idea of health and having this bandwidth to handle things, I think most soft tissue things happen within the eccentric under velocity, probably in a lengthened position. So you can train that. You get in within these deep end ranges of motion, overload the eccentric, and you can overload the eccentric via velocity, which we'll do at the end of our off season, with like myotatic type reps where you're dropping, free falling into these lengthened positions and forcing those muscle spindles to trigger and learning how to create momentum. And then, so that's like 15 weeks, honing in on just eccentric contraction. And we get a lot of like, I think it's so underdeveloped. We get a lot of like our highest jumps within our year after like this off season, because it's such like an untapped contraction. It's so underdeveloped. Most people, if they do train it very submaximally for like a 3-week block. And then they go like the traditional triphasic kind of deal. But you can train, like I said, you can train these same things for so long in yield adaptation. So we're gonna squeeze the juice as long as possible. So the full 15 weeks of our semester. So we kind of go submaximal, overloaded eccentrics, and then velocity to finish. So within that velocity, it's learning now how to leverage momentum and be efficient, taking that momentum on from the fast eccentric. And so for us, how we want to do this is we would use a VBT, and we're trying to emphasize the concentric being as fast as possible. But for that to happen, you have to be super efficient in one, carrying over the free fall of a myotatic rep and using the stretch shortening cycle and the muscle spindles and accelerate out of that bottom and leverage that momentum as fast as possible. So that's the first kind of like taste of trying to create efficiency in taking on a ton of potential energy and then turn it over into concentric velocity. And then as we get more specific, we want to take this idea into jumping high. And then from there, as we go into our preseason, I call it like a second off season. We have 8 weeks in the summer, where we'll now start training a little more on adding overcoming isometrics, a little more concentric bias type things, where there is propulsion's obviously very important when you want to jump high. So we'll start addressing that within the preseason of just purely putting force down within your feet and just training propulsive forces. So overcoming isometrics, concentric bias, partial range of motion lifting. And then it's just, we'll still address the eccentric, but we may be addressing within velocity still and trying to now just create a more efficient amortization phase. And this is where our angles start to get a little more shallow that we might see within the approach. So just getting really efficient within that angle. And just, again, eccentrics, now we're training We're still training eccentrics with velocity, but the angles are a little more shallow, adding a lot more concentric bias things with overcoming isometrics. And then from there, we're just playing. And that's really like our off season. That's about 24-ish weeks of training, with the goal of just creating an efficient stretch shortening cycle. One thing that we do a ton of that you may not see is we do a ton of plyometrics. Obviously, like that's the best predicator of using the stretch shortening cycle probably is a true plyometric. So my favorite and the one we'll train all year long is a depth jump. And obviously there's 1,000 variations of how you can train that. So within our off season, I think the angles are important. So just traditional, just depth dropping maybe off an 18-inch box and creating the awareness at the angle we want. We term it like 120-degree knee angle. Because as we get into more intensive plyometrics, that's probably the angle we're probably going to be turning over at anyways. So early on in the off season, creating awareness at the angle, which is traditional depth dropping and frequency, hammering a ton of reps at that angle. But I will say we try to not be compliant on that eccentric and have like a hard, stiff landing. And then from there, it's just traditional. We'll start depth jumping. Maybe we're adding variations of varying box height. Maybe we're consecutive hurdle hopping after. Maybe you're doing depth. Like the variations are endless. So that's one thing. Like we're not just squatting. We are doing a ton of true plyometric work with depth jumping, consecutive hopping, that kind of deal. And then there's a massive component of technical work we do within the approach and the penultimate that I think is honestly probably the biggest difference maker for most people is just getting technically better and efficient jumping. We'll probably add 1 to 2 inches easy without training. But yeah, that's pretty much our off-season, preseason in a nutshell. Create a really efficient stretch shortening cycle and get technically sound at the approach. And it usually takes care of itself.
Yeah, within that, I'm glad you mentioned the plyometrics because I hadn't seen you post too much, or I don't think I'd seen any plyometric activities. So I was wondering if you just focus on those strength qualities and then let volleyball do itself do that. So I'm glad you mentioned that there with the depth jump.
Yeah,
piece.
we'll do a true depth jumping every week, 52 weeks out of the year in some capacity. As we get more intensive, we'll do a lot of consecutive hurdle hopping. I really like consecutive hurdle hoppings on the cheer mat because it gives you a little bit of an elastic recoil naturally from the surface. So it makes it a little more efficient for them. But yeah, I'm a big value on true plyometrics. And we will do some like jumping, like weighted jumping in some capacity. But like I said earlier, like whether it's just a counter movement jump on the bar in the back, maybe it's a time frame where we're biasing the concentric contraction, so we're complexing maybe an overcoming isometric and a non-counter movement jump where you have no momentum. So we do all of these things for sure. I guess I haven't posted.
Yeah, a regular depth jump is probably kind of if someone just drops jump, that's kind of it's not very exciting compared to cool. Very, very cool lifting variations.
Yeah.
I haven't posted a regular depth jump in probably like 5 years, unless it was like some Russian guy who jumps like super high. It's just sometimes the way things go. So I'm glad to hear that. I'd love to see you post, even if it's a little more standard. I'd love to see a few more of those videos of yours.
I need to get better at posting that. I get so caught up in here's the same squat every week. Yeah. Probably gets old really fast.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a really powerful, and I just love the Zerchers with the fat bar. It's just and the slam, that's just such a match made in heaven for squatting effectiveness.
I think it can regardless of anthropometrics, it can make any anthropometric human probably squat well. Just again, center of mass, elevating the heels, biasing that upright torso. It's such a comfortable position, so easy to load. Yeah, highly, highly recommend.
Yeah. Traditional reps. So like regular up and down stuff. Do you have that in any place in your program, or does that fit in there?
Yeah, there's definitely value. Just traditional progressive overload, especially early in our off season with newbies. I'm never going to hold them back from a loading standpoint as long as it's technically sound and they're sticking to these tempos. But I don't get too caught up into the nuance of like standard sets and reps and those kind of loading parameters. There is like times and places for sure. Like I said, at the end of this off season, we will run our second lower body day, like traditional, like wave loading, like a 3-2-1, just to kind of get an expression of maximal strength. Because that's something we don't intentionally address through the off season, but it's cool to see like the indirect effect on the maximal strength with some wave loading, and you'll see kids move a ton of weight. But outside of that, no, I keep it pretty simple. Like working in, depending on the time of year, if we're working, like if I'm addressing like structural changes, I'm gonna more so bias time than I am repping. Um, so usually like like on these major lifts of squatting, I probably don't do anything more than 5 reps within the year. Um, now if there's like a red shirt kid, that can change. But yeah, keep it pretty simple. Like obviously we're running clusters with the weight releasers, because you just kind of have to if you want to get more
There's
than
no
one
other
rep.
choice essentially until someone invents something that's kind of a funky. Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
like 1080 quantum or something, right? But
Yeah,
other than that,
if only.
yeah.
But I more so value the accumulating various times under tension, accumulating total time or time within the rep, time within a certain position, from an awareness standpoint. And then same thing, like within like these overloaded eccentrics, just accumulating time, whether it's 6 or 4 second lowers. Um, yeah, no, I've kind of moved away from getting into the nuance of sets and reps. I don't think that makes enough quantifiable change for me to focus so much on. If body composition maybe is a big emphasis, maybe that's where you kind of focus on that a little more. But I think for what we're trying to do, it doesn't matter. It does, but it's not the biggest thing to worry about.
Yeah, it sounds like in a way, where strength and conditioning or athletic performance or sports science, or I mean, they're all kind of the same thing. Like it tends to be very quantitative compared to the athletic piece, which is more, you could say it's more the art or whatever term you want to use. Or it's just more chaotic, problem solving chaos. But in some ways, if you look at things as, it's almost like what's trying to be achieved and going outside of sets and reps and numbers to do that. Like, are you thinking more of just like, you think more of what tension is happening, this thing happening, than, okay, we did, 3 sets of 10 this week, and we're going to go 3 sets of 8 next week and 5 sets of 5, like that.
There's so many variables that go into the expression of just moving weight. That's not the adaptation we're looking for. Like we're looking for like specific adaptation and contractile tissue at specific ranges of motion. And, that's really it. And then the skill to leverage momentum and use the stretch shortening cycle. And I don't think a set and rep scheme is going to help us achieve those things any different. At the end of the day, like if they're jumping higher, like which is the end goal, and I can quantify that to some capacity, like that's all I truly care about.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in a way, you mentioned just how laser focused the point of the program is. We're going to get you, and that fits with it, because if you get too diluted in, I'm going to do this scheme and I'm going to do this scheme, it can dilute from almost what's really happening on the level of the physiology.
That's it. Exactly. You're going in too many different directions. And then going back to, yes, we'll yield result, but I want to yield the best possible result that's going to make a difference. And the business of winning and losing in our sport is jumping high. So if you have the ability to jump high, you probably have an advantage. And even like in a recruiting standpoint, like when we can show, like everybody's probably talking to, I would hope, is talking to a strength coach when they're going on a recruiting visit. And we're going over these results for these kids that probably only have a year. And if we can like wow you with results and train, because we know jumping is really important to your sport. And for us now, we're getting kids that's like, hey, I want to play professional. I only have 1 year. My physicality is my limiting factor. It's like, okay, great. Like this is the perfect place for you. Because here's kids that have only been a year and have added X amount of inches. So if you value training, you need to jump higher. So yeah, I think that's another reason to like only hone in on like a specific thing that's going to make a massive difference. I don't want to be jack of all trades in this world. I've definitely transitioned away from that.
Yeah.
I used to think you need to be, but the dynamic of NCAA sports is so different now.
Yeah.
It's winning and losing. You got 1 year, maximize your results. It's like, okay, you have to go laser focused or the results are pretty mediocre.
Yeah. Just a couple quick questions to finish up. One, I wanted to get in a little bit more with the fast reversal. So like you mentioned like going through the slower eccentric, the super max, and then trying to get quicker reversal. And obviously depth jumps great for that, but with weights and like weighted variations. And this is also fresh on my mind with Mike Bruno talking about like how fast can we, Bill Hartman speak, ascend the pelvic floor, how fast can we reverse that action? But I'm always thinking about more ways to do that in the weight room and how others are doing it. So if you could share a little bit on that, and then I have one last question for you.
Yeah. So I think the stretch shortening cycle is really unique. I think a lot of people kind of just like term it's like it's just the tendon's ability to like recoil. But it's a lot of different things. It's probably like I know of like 4. There's probably 100 more. Like obviously the tendon ability to like take on load and recoil. But then there's also the muscle spindles, specifically within the lengthened position. Now, obviously, they're inhibitors. When they get stretched too much, they contract, and you can leverage that ability to generate forces. So which we will do, and then within the sarcomere and Titan specifically, the makeup of Titan is elastic in nature. So if you have a million of these like little sarcomeres that have these like essentially small tendons, they kind of act as a tendon in the same capacity when they get into these lengthened positions. They also recoil back. But the key there is length. So with the muscle spindle and Titan. So for us, when we're in our off season, and again, the bandwidth to handle forces, including velocity, we'll do what's called a myotatic rep, where you kind of just control the first half of the range. And then it's essentially just a free fall into the bottom range of motion. And that should trigger those muscle spindles and then the elastic Titan to essentially those passive structures, essentially create that momentum. And now how efficient are you to be able to use all that momentum to create velocity and force? So we don't want to dissipate the momentum and then have a slow concentric. We want to use all of that momentum from those passive structures and create an extremely fast concentric contraction. And we'll do that specifically in lengthened positions. And then, like you're saying, if I want to use like traditional true stretch shortening cycle, leverage the tendons ability, depth jumping, true plyometrics are king. But again, from a health standpoint, a bandwidth standpoint to handle chaos, velocity is probably the missing component, and specifically velocity in lengthened positions. So that allows us to address that in some capacity.
Yeah, I really loved like the myotatic rep because I was thinking about Christian Thibodeau. I had heard that from him. It was like in the neurotyping course. If you're an elastic type, that was that's the first time I'd heard it. So it's cool that this is the second time. And right on the tail end of thinking about that reversal aspect. So it was something I read and I was like, I need to try this. I need to have athletes try this. But maybe you need to have enough people say it, and then it's like, okay, now I'm going to do this. So I love that idea. I'll definitely have to. I think with squats too. Just like, and heels elevated and just really just truly hitting the legs on that drop too. Because I think if you have the feet flat, you could get a lot of that catches in like the bone structure of the spine and muscles that aren't really involved in getting that pelvic floor to rip back up. So one thing I wanted to touch on you mentioned this before we hit record. I think it's so important because people listen to this podcast, and this is specific for higher performance athletes, like someone working with like, 9th and 10th graders in high school, right? Like there's a certain progression to get to the place that you're at. So if you could speak a little bit to the audience that you have, like what would a group of athletes need to be ready for this? And at what age do you feel like some of these more advanced methods are really appropriate for athletes to start with?
Yeah, I think like the systems and methods we're using, there's obviously some inherent risk as you maximally load like kids on their back. But again, going back to this idea of maximizing results, you have to risk in some capacity. But I think if you've been doing it long enough, you kind of know how to mitigate that risk with like just the true coaching eye. So for us, like if you like just trying to maximize results in the shortest amount of time in what I feel like I can quantify, specifically for my sport and my population, like this is kind of what I'm always going to defer to. Like, don't get me wrong, there's value in just like training traditional 4 sets of 5, progressive overload. You'll probably yield some quality results. But again, like I'm trying to yield the best possible results in 1 year because we're trying to like win a national championship. So I want like the most physical team in the country. And so for us, like training probably has to like show that, there's going to be some inherent risk to this training. There's a lot of like systemic fatigue within this training that you have to account for. And like, this is not going to work with an undertrained, like 16-year-old, 15, like youth sport athlete, because most of these kids are 18 plus that have some experience training because we're getting like high level kids. They're either training with a private person while they're in high school, or transferring in and they have some experience within the training conditioning world. And for me, within my sessions also, we're doing so few things and we're doing it so frequently that their skill, like, they grasp the skill extremely fast because of frequency, and like we're not doing so much. Like sometimes we're doing three things in a full hour session, because I need them to be the best at those things for what we're doing with the weight releasers. So no, this does not work with like the undertrained blank slate, like kid that doesn't even know if they're going to play college sports. That probably just need general training. They can get away with doing, goblet squats and push-ups every day.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is going to be much more beneficial for like youth sport athletes in the macro sense. If you're wanting to set them up probably when they get to college, than it is like being super aggressive with loading parameters and fancy systems of contraction types, because it's probably going to make a myth in that population anyways, because they're not skilled enough within the movements or even have the awareness to be able to do those things. So within youth, I've never trained youth sport athletes, so it's hard for me to like comment on it. But I think just training general awareness is probably going to be more beneficial in the macro sense than it is any fancy system or method that I'm running. Because yeah, like I said, I'm working with kids that are probably going to be professional athletes one day and are playing at the highest level relative to their sport. So training kind of has to mimic that.
Yeah. I think all the high school and those the undertrained athletes, if they watched and like, oh man, look at this crawls and deep tier jumps and
that's what you
all
need
the
to be
rolls.
doing. Yeah.
Focus on that one. Yeah, for sure. For so many of those younger athletes,
Yeah.
so good. Well, hey, thank you so much, Anthony. It was awesome talking to you. Thank you for sharing the insight in your system, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate it, man.
No, this is awesome. Yeah, thank you. This is great. I was definitely looking forward to this one.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here. I'll see you next week with another great guest.